A black woman, minding her business on a routine flight when suddenly a flight attendant slaps her across the face. What happens next is jaw-dropping. Stay with us to see how this billionaire's daughter turned humiliation into pure power. The plane was packed with passengers, each one settling into their seats for what was supposed to be a routine, uneventful flight. The hum of conversations, the gentle rustle of papers, and the soft clicks of seatbelts being fastened filled the cabin. But little did anyone know, this seemingly ordinary flight would soon take a dramatic turn, one that no one aboard would ever forget. In the first-class section of the plane, a young woman sat calmly, flipping through a magazine, seemingly lost in thought. Her name was Tasha Winters, and she was the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the world, Jay Winters, a black tech mogul whose name was synonymous with innovation, success, and ambition. Despite being only in her mid-20s, Tasha had already made a name for herself in the business world, inheriting not just her father's immense fortune, but also his unyielding drive and sharp intellect. Tasha was more than just the heir to a fortune. She was carving out her own path in the business realm. But today she wasn't thinking about meetings or mergers. Today, she was simply a passenger, trying to enjoy a much-needed break from her busy life. As the plane soared higher into the sky, Tasha settled back in her plush seat, hoping for some peace and quiet. But the calm was not to last. Meanwhile, in the same first-class cabin, there was another woman, Brittany, a flight attendant in her 30s. Brittany had a reputation among her colleagues for being no-nonsense, short-tempered, and always strictly adhering to the rules. She took her job very seriously, perhaps a little too seriously, and was known to be exacting in her attention to detail. For Brittany, perfection was non-negotiable, especially in first class, where the standards were higher and the passengers often more demanding. She prided herself on maintaining the utmost decorum and comfort, always ensuring that everything was flawless. It was this dedication to the rules that would soon lead to a confrontation. As Brittany made her rounds through the cabin, checking on the passengers, making sure everyone was settled, she noticed Tasha. From a distance, it seemed that Tasha wasn't paying attention to her seatbelt, which in Brittany's eyes was an unforgivable oversight. Without taking a moment to assess the situation or consider the context, Brittany decided to approach. Tasha, who had been distracted by a message on her phone, hadn't even noticed that her seatbelt was slightly loose. To her, everything seemed perfectly fine, until Brittany appeared by her side. "Excuse me, miss," Brittany's voice cut through, the quiet of the cabin sharp and cold, sending a wave of unease through Tasha's relaxed state. "I need you to fasten your seatbelt properly. Please pay attention to the instructions." The words felt almost too harsh, and Tasha looked up, momentarily confused, before realizing what was happening. She hadn't even noticed that her seatbelt wasn't properly fastened. Flustered and embarrassed, Tasha quickly nodded and apologized. She hadn't meant to break any rules, but the tone of Brittany's voice felt unnecessarily harsh. Her eyes shifted down toward her seatbelt, and she made sure it clicked into place. However, Brittany, still standing stiffly in front of her, crossed her arms over her chest, looking down at Tasha as if expecting her to do more. Her expression was one of disapproval, not compassion. Tasha, who had been used to people respecting her boundaries and space, felt the tension in the air. She gave Brittany a small, awkward smile, hoping to ease the tension. "I'm sorry, I wasn't paying attention," she said softly, but Brittany remained unmoved. The air was thick with unspoken judgment, and Tasha's discomfort only deepened. It was a momentary interaction, but for some reason it felt as though Brittany was looking for more than just a correction. The sharpness in her voice, the impatience in her stance, it all felt like a personal attack, even though it clearly wasn't. Tasha, still stunned by the exchange, was about to pull out her phone again to distract herself when she felt a sudden, forceful sting across her cheek. The sound of the slap was shocking, so loud it seemed to reverberate through the cabin. For a second, time seemed to slow down. Tasha's eyes widened in disbelief as she reached up instinctively to touch her cheek, feeling the warmth of the impact. It wasn't just a light tap. This was a full, unapologetic slap, and the intensity of it left her speechless. The entire cabin went silent. Every passenger in the first-class section froze, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Was this some sort of mistake? Surely no one would slap a passenger, especially one who had done nothing more than adjust her seatbelt. But there it was, the unmistakable aftermath of Brittany's rash decision to take matters into her own hands. The room seemed to hold its breath as Tasha stared up at Brittany in shock. Her hand was still on her cheek, and for a moment, she couldn't even process what had just happened. "How dare you!" Tasha's voice broke the silence, her shock giving way to a surge of anger. She stood up, her body tense and her pulse racing. "I was just fixing my seatbelt. You didn't need to do that." The words hung in the air, and Brittany, who had expected an apology or meek compliance, simply stood there, arms still crossed, her expression as icy as ever. "You're lucky I didn't do more," she replied, her voice colder than before. "You need to follow the rules next time." Tasha's hands clenched into fists, her fingers trembling with frustration. The slap still stung, not just physically, but emotionally. She had never been humiliated like this, especially in front of a room full of strangers. As she stood there, trying to collect herself, she heard a voice, a calm, powerful voice, cut through the tension. "Excuse me," the voice said, deep and commanding. Brittany's gaze shifted, and her face went pale as she realized who had just spoken. It was Jay Winters, the man she had just unknowingly disrespected. Tasha's father. Jay Winters, known for his calm demeanor and immense wealth, had been walking toward the first-class cabin after settling in the rear of the plane. He had been unaware of the confrontation at first, but as soon as he stepped into the cabin, he saw the aftermath of Brittany's rash actions, the slap, the humiliation, and his daughter standing there, her face flushed with anger and confusion. Jay's sharp eyes locked onto Brittany. "Did you just hit my daughter?" His voice was low, but it carried an authority that made everyone in the cabin sit up straight. Brittany's face drained of color, and she stammered, trying to explain herself. I thought she wasn't following the rules," she sputtered. "I was just doing my job." But Jay's expression didn't waver. He was no longer the composed businessman everyone had seen in public. This was the father, the protector. "You don't lay your hands on anyone, especially not my daughter," Jay said, his voice unwavering. "This is not how you handle things. Not with her, and not with anyone." The other passengers, who had been watching quietly, began murmuring amongst themselves, some of them starting to reach for their phones. The tension was palpable, and it was clear that this situation was escalating quickly. Brittany, now realizing the gravity of what she had done, tried to explain herself further, but Jay was already having none of it. "You will be dealt with," Jay said coldly. "I'm not going to stand here and let this go." The airline staff quickly intervened, and within minutes, the captain arrived to handle the situation. Brittany, her face red with embarrassment and regret, was escorted off the plane and suspended from her duties. The damage had been done, and no amount of apologies could undo the humiliation she had caused. As for Tasha, she stood by her father, still trying to process the shock of it all. Jay, though angry, was calm and reassuring. He had always been there for her, and she knew he would always have her back. This was just another moment in her life where her father's presence made all the difference. In the aftermath, the airline issued an official apology stating that the flight attendant would be investigated, and they promised to retrain their staff on proper customer service and conflict resolution. Brittany was eventually fired, and the incident became a viral sensation, circulating quickly on social media. The story of the slap spread like wildfire, making headlines across the country. But amidst the fallout, Tasha's heart began to heal, knowing that her father had stepped in to protect her. What had started as a simple flight turned into a life lesson about respect, about family, and about standing up for what's right. For Tasha, it was a reminder that no matter what happened, in life she would never face it alone. What happened next was so shocking that it sent a ripple of disbelief through the entire cabin. Without any warning, Brittany's hand shot out in a swift, forceful motion, slapping Tasha across the face. The sound of the impact was sharp and unmistakable, reverberating through the quiet, tense air of the first-class section. It wasn't a gentle tap or a light reprimand. It was a full, unapologetic slap. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, and the silence that followed was deafening. The passengers around them gasped, their eyes widening in astonishment. Many instinctively looked away, but some couldn't help but stare, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. The suddenness of the act left the entire cabin in a state of stunned silence. Tasha's body stiffened, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and outrage. She couldn't even process what had just happened. The sting of the slap, the heat that spread across her cheek seemed unreal. How had things escalated so quickly? She was merely trying to fasten her seatbelt, distracted by a text message, when this flight attendant had taken it upon herself to deliver an assault. For a moment, Tasha didn't even know how to react. Was she dreaming? Was this some sort of twisted joke? But the pain on her cheek was too real. Her heart pounded in her chest and her breath hitched as a sense of fury began to build. This was no accident. This was a blatant act of disrespect, and it had happened to her, in front of all these strangers. She had always prided herself on being calm and composed in stressful situations, but now she could feel the anger bubbling up, rising from the pit of her stomach. She had never been humiliated like this before. Slowly, her hand lifted to her cheek, still feeling the lingering sting. But as her fingers brushed against her skin, a surge of energy coursed through her, propelling her into action. Her voice broke through the silence, sharp and furious. "How dare you?" she spat, standing up from her seat, her face flushed with the rush of adrenaline. "I was just fixing my seatbelt. You didn't need to do that." Her words were laced with a mix of disbelief and raw anger. She couldn't understand how someone could be so cruel, so dismissive of basic decency. This was not the way to handle a minor mistake. This was over the top. But Brittany didn't flinch. Instead, she stood there, arms crossed, her expression cold and stern, as if this was nothing more than an everyday occurrence. She didn't even acknowledge the pain she had caused or the shock of her action. Instead, she simply stared at Tasha. With a dismissive gaze, her lips curled into a thin line. "You're lucky I didn't do more," Brittany said icily, her tone dismissive as if the slap were nothing more than an afterthought. "Follow the rules next time." Tasha's stomach churned with disbelief. Did she really just say that? Was this woman so detached from the reality of what had just transpired that she thought this was somehow justified? The words cut deep, and Tasha felt her anger rising even more. Her body was trembling not from fear, but from the sheer injustice of it all. She had done nothing wrong, and yet here she was, publicly humiliated in front of strangers. Her mind raced as she searched for the right words to convey just how wrong this was. But before she could respond, the cabin seemed to freeze, the tension in the air thick and suffocating. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. No one dared to say anything. The weight of the moment was too heavy, the awkwardness too palpable. It felt like everyone was holding their breath, unsure of how this would unfold. Tasha stood there, her fists clenched at her sides, trying to steady her breathing. She could feel her face burning, not just from the sting of the slap, but from the shame of being treated this way. But little did Brittany know, this wasn't just any passenger she had just slapped. Tasha Winters wasn't just a young woman traveling for business. She was the daughter of one of the richest and most influential men in the world. Jay Winters, a self-made billionaire whose empire spanned across technology, entertainment, and more. Jay was known for his calm demeanor, his strategic mind, and his unwavering protection of his family. And today, as luck would have it, Jay was standing just behind Tasha, having entered the first-class cabin moments after the slap. He had been looking forward to a quiet flight, a chance to relax and escape the pressures of his empire for a little while. But as soon as he stepped into the cabin, he saw it all. His daughter, standing there with her cheek flushed from the slap, and the flight attendant standing in front of her, completely indifferent to the chaos she had caused. Jay's eyes narrowed as he took in the situation. His jaw clenched and his fists instinctively tightened. He had been watching Tasha from a distance, but the moment he saw the slap, everything changed. The anger in his chest bubbled up, but he kept his cool, focusing on the situation before him. He had worked his entire life to protect his family, to shield them from the harshness of the world, and now someone had dared to disrespect his daughter in this way. He wasn't going to let this go. Jay Winters was not a man who tolerated disrespect, especially not when it came to his family. With deliberate steps, he approached the confrontation, the sound of his polished shoes clicking against the floor of the cabin. Brittany, still standing with her arms crossed, didn't notice him at first. But the moment she heard his voice, her entire demeanor changed. "Excuse me," Jay said, his voice low but powerful, slicing through the tension in the cabin like a hot knife through butter. Brittany froze and turned around, her eyes widening in recognition. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Jay Winters was not just any man. He was a billionaire tech mogul, a household name, and the father of the woman she had just humiliated. "Did you just hit my daughter?" His voice was calm, but the weight of his words hung heavy in the air, and Brittany's face turned a shade paler. Her mind raced, trying to process the situation, but she had no excuse. She had acted impulsively, without considering the consequences. I thought she wasn't following the rules," Brittany stammered, trying to defend her actions. "I was just doing my job." But Jay wasn't having it. His gaze was unwavering and his tone was filled with authority. "You don't lay your hands on anyone, especially not my daughter," he said coldly, stepping closer to Brittany. "This is not how you handle things. Not with her, and not with anyone." The words were final, and Brittany realized the gravity of the situation. The passengers around them were watching closely now, some taking out their phones, some murmuring among themselves. The tension in the cabin had reached a breaking point. Jay wasn't the kind of man who would let an injustice like this slide, and it was clear to everyone now that Brittany had made a monumental mistake. Brittany's face flushed with embarrassment, but she didn't have much time to process it. Before the captain of the flight arrived, along with other flight attendants, the scene quickly escalated as they took Brittany aside, and it wasn't long before she was removed from her duties and escorted off the plane. The airline staff apologized profusely to Jay and Tasha, but Jay wasn't interested in empty words. He had his lawyers contact the airline immediately, and an official investigation into the incident was launched. Brittany was suspended and the airline promised to take corrective action. Meanwhile, Tasha, still processing the events, felt a deep sense of relief, knowing that her father had her back. As the flight continued, the incident began to spread through social media like wildfire. People were shocked by what had happened, and the story quickly became a trending topic. Jay Winters, however, wasn't concerned with the media attention. He had handled the situation in his own way, quietly, firmly, and decisively. For Tasha, the incident served as a reminder of how quickly things could escalate, but also how important it was to stand up for yourself and for those you loved. In the end, she knew she could always count on her father's unwavering support, no matter what. Jay Winters was known for his calm, composed demeanor, a man who rarely let anything disturb his well-guarded composure. But what had just unfolded before him was entirely different. His daughter Tasha was standing there, her cheek still flushed from the slap that had just been delivered by a flight attendant, a slap that no one, especially not Tasha, would ever have expected. Jay's eyes, usually calm, now burned with a fierce protectiveness as he walked toward the scene. His polished shoes clicked purposefully on the floor, each step breaking the eerie silence that had settled over the cabin. The air felt heavy, and a sense of unease hung in the air, as if every single passenger was holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. When Jay's voice cut through the tension, it was smooth but stern, an unmistakable authority laced in every word. "Excuse me," he said, and instantly the flight attendant Brittany turned around. She blinked in surprise, her eyes wide as she took in the figure before her. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized who stood before her. Jay Winters, the man she had just unknowingly humiliated her fellow passenger in front of. His reputation as one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the world made his presence undeniable. The reality of the situation began to sink in, and Brittany's face flushed a deep shade of crimson. The sharp sting of embarrassment hit her, and she found herself struggling to form words. How could she have possibly known that the woman she had just slapped was the daughter of one of the most powerful men on the planet? She had simply been enforcing what she thought were the rules, not realizing she was crossing a line that would have severe consequences. As she looked up at Jay, her nerves overtook her, and her voice faltered. I thought she wasn't following the rules, she stammered, trying to justify her actions. I was just doing my job, sir. The words spilled out in a panic, but they did nothing to ease the tension in the air. Jay's eyes, however, remained unwavering. His jaw clenched, his face devoid of any compassion for the flustered flight attendant, standing before him. You don't lay your hands on anyone, let alone my daughter, Jay said, his voice colder than ice, yet completely controlled. The words weren't shouted, but they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken consequences. This is not how you handle things, not with her and not with anyone. With each syllable, his tone deepened, solidifying the authority in his words. Brittany, still standing frozen in place, swallowed hard. She realized too late that her knee-jerk reaction had just triggered a chain of events she couldn't undo. It wasn't just the slap. It was the disrespect that came with it, and she had failed to see that she was crossing a line. Jay's presence alone made her feel like a small child caught doing something wrong. His demeanor, poised and sharp, didn't leave room for excuses. The passengers who had been silently observing the incident couldn't help but murmur amongst themselves now. The ripple effect of Jay's words spread throughout the cabin like wildfire. They had all been witnesses to a shocking moment, a flight attendant slapping a passenger, something that, under normal circumstances, would never have been tolerated. But now, with the situation escalating and Jay making it clear that he would not stand for it, the atmosphere shifted completely. The tension in the cabin was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone, from the wealthy business travelers to the casual vacationers, knew that this was a moment that would change everything. Brittany, who had been so sure of herself moments before, was now visibly sweating. She could feel her face heat up as all eyes were on her. The reality of what she had done was hitting her like a ton of bricks. She had tried to justify her actions, but Jay wasn't buying it. His calm authority was impenetrable, and he wasn't one to let minor mistakes slide when they affected those he cared about. It was clear to everyone now that Brittany had grossly misjudged the situation. She had assumed that because she worked for the airline, she held power in every situation, that she could treat people however she wanted in the name of following the rules. But the rules didn't justify violence or humiliation, and she had crossed a line she didn't even know existed. As the cabin held its collective breath, the sound of a soft voice broke through the tension. Sir, Brittany began, her voice shaking, but Jay cut her off. No more words, he said firmly. You've said enough. His words were like a cold wind, cutting through her weak attempts to explain herself. The passengers, meanwhile, watched as the situation unfolded, some of them shaking their heads in disbelief, others tapping on their phones as they tried to capture this surreal moment. Tasha, who had been standing silently by, still processing the humiliation she had just suffered, looked up at her father with a mixture of gratitude and awe. She had always known her father to be a calm, level-headed man, someone who dealt with situations with quiet confidence. But seeing him in action now, so fiercely protective of her, made her feel a deep sense of security. This wasn't just about the slap. It was about the power of family, the way Jay had stepped in without hesitation, without fear of confrontation. He didn't need to yell or raise his voice. His presence alone commanded respect. Jay's attention was now fully focused on Brittany. He wasn't angry in the way one might expect. There was no shouting, no bluster. Instead, his words were simple, direct, and final. You will not continue in your role. I'm having this matter dealt with immediately, he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. His calm authority left no doubt in anyone's mind that he would see this situation to its rightful conclusion, and Brittany's career would likely not be the same after today. As the flight attendant stood frozen, Jay's next move was already in motion. He turned his attention to the other members of the airline crew, who had been lingering in the back, unsure of how to intervene. The captain, who had been made aware of the altercation by one of the passengers, finally arrived in the cabin. Without hesitation, Jay addressed him directly. "This needs to be handled, immediately. This woman cannot remain on this flight." The captain nodded quickly, his face a mix of concern and disbelief at the unfolding drama. "Of course, Mr. Winters," he said, stepping forward to address Brittany. The rest of the airline staff was quick to act, leading Brittany away from the scene, her face a mask of humiliation. She had no choice but to follow, her every step heavy with the weight of the mistake she had just made. It wasn't long before Brittany was escorted off the plane, and the staff apologized profusely to Tasha and Jay. The captain offered his sincere regrets as well, but Jay wasn't interested in empty words. The damage had been done. The incident had taken a life of its own, already beginning to spread through social media. Jay's lawyers had already been contacted, and an official investigation was underway. As the plane settled back into a sense of calm, the passengers who had witnessed the ordeal remained uneasy, some exchanging words, others silently reflecting on what they had just seen. For Tasha, the immediate shock began to wear off, replaced by a deep sense of relief. She knew that her father would always have her back no matter what. In that moment, she realized that this wasn't just about the slap. It was a reminder of how much her father truly loved her, and how far he would go to protect her. The story, as expected, didn't end there. The incident quickly went viral, spreading across social media platforms, making headlines in the news, and sparking debates about professionalism, respect, and the treatment of passengers. But for Jay Winters and his daughter, it wasn't the media attention that mattered. What mattered was the unshakable bond between them, a bond that no amount of public scrutiny could ever break. They had weathered the storm together, and it was clear that they would always stand strong as a family. The situation was spiraling fast, and the flight attendants, who had been silently watching from the back of the plane, were now called to intervene. Soon the captain arrived as well, his face a mix of concern and authority. But by the time they had all gathered, the damage had already been done. Brittany, the flight attendant who had slapped Tasha, stood with her head bowed, her face ashen, and her hands shaking. She had made a mistake, an enormous one, and now she was about to face the consequences. She had acted impulsively, without thinking about the repercussions, and now, as she realized who Tasha truly was, her mistake felt even more monumental. Tasha, standing beside her father, felt a strange mix of emotions coursing through her. She was still in shock, trying to process the incident that had just unfolded. This wasn't how she imagined her flight would go. Her entire life, she had been accustomed to a certain level of privilege, but she had never expected to be treated like this, especially not by someone in a position of authority. She had spent years building her own career, cultivating a reputation for being strong and independent, but in that moment, all of that felt irrelevant. She had been humiliated, in front of complete strangers, and nothing could erase the sting of that slap. The flight attendants led Brittany aside, their faces stern, and the captain, with his authoritative presence, exchanged a few hushed words with the staff. Tasha, however, didn't feel like there was anything more to be said. The altercation had unfolded so quickly, and now it was already becoming something far bigger than any of them could have anticipated. Her father, Jay Winters, had remained calm throughout the ordeal. He had not raised his voice, nor had he lost his composure. Despite the anger simmering beneath the surface, he had approached the situation with a quiet determination. "Don't worry, Tasha. We'll handle this," he had said softly, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. His voice was reassuring, and somehow it made her feel a little better. She trusted him completely, and knowing that he had things under control brought her a sense of comfort amidst the chaos. Still, the sting of the slap lingered, and the shame of the public confrontation weighed heavily on her. But the world outside, the plane was already buzzing with the news. As the incident had unfolded, several passengers had discreetly pulled out their phones, capturing every moment of the confrontation. Within minutes, the story was circulating across social media platforms, And it didn't take long for the headlines to start pouring in. "Billionaire's daughter slapped by flight attendant," one headline blared. "Tech mogul's family humiliated on flight," another one read. The story had gone viral, sparking debates about professionalism, respect, and the treatment of passengers. Tasha couldn't help but feel a sense of helplessness as she saw the story unravel in real time. This was supposed to be a simple flight, a few hours of peace and quiet. Instead, it had turned into a spectacle that was now the talk of the entire internet. Some of the comments were sympathetic, expressing outrage over the flight attendant's actions. Others, however, were more critical, questioning why Tasha had been so disrespectful or distracted in the first place. The opinions were divided, but the one thing that was clear was that this incident was not going to be forgotten anytime soon. Back on the plane, the airline was in full damage control mode. Representatives quickly issued a public apology, promising an immediate investigation into the matter. Brittany was suspended from her duties, and the company stated that they would take appropriate action following the inquiry. But the damage to the airline's reputation had already been done. The story had spread far and wide, and no amount of press releases could undo the stain this incident had left on their image. Meanwhile, Tasha remained quiet. She didn't want to make the situation any worse than it already was. She had always prided herself on her ability to handle difficult situations with grace, but this was different. This wasn't just about a mistake or a miscommunication. This was about an act of humiliation, and she wasn't sure how to process it. Still, as much as the incident had shaken her, she knew one thing for sure. She had the unwavering support of her father, and that meant everything. Jay Winters had a reputation for being calm, collected, and measured. He had built an empire from the ground up, never letting emotions cloud his judgment. Yet, in that moment, Tasha could sense that his protectiveness over her was more intense than ever before. He wasn't the kind of man to make a scene, but when it came to his family, he would do whatever it took to ensure their safety and dignity. The way he had stepped in, with quiet authority, was something she would never forget. As the plane continued its journey, the passengers were still talking about what had just happened. Some were trying to get more information, while others were discussing their opinions on the situation. Tasha overheard a few whispered conversations, and while some of the passengers had sympathy for her, others seemed to think that Brittany had acted in the right, citing the importance of following the rules. It was strange to hear people debating something that had felt so personal to her. She had been on the receiving end of an injustice, yet it seemed like some people were still trying to justify it. The flight eventually landed, but the story didn't end there. By the time they arrived at their destination, the incident had already made headlines across the globe. Social media had exploded with reactions, and news outlets were covering the story in detail. The hashtag #JagraJustice for Tasha was trending, and online discussions ranged from expressing outrage over the flight attendant's behavior to questioning the broader issue of how passengers were sometimes treated on flights. Jay, however, remained focused on what truly mattered: his family. As soon as they deplaned, he got to work, contacting his lawyers to ensure that the incident would be fully investigated. He wasn't interested in the media frenzy or the public opinion. What mattered was that his daughter had been wronged, and he wasn't going to let it slide. The airline had already promised to look into the matter, but Jay's approach was different. He wasn't just looking for an apology, he wanted accountability. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal discussions, meetings, and public statements. The airline worked hard to salvage its reputation, but the fallout from the incident was inevitable. Meanwhile, Tasha remained quiet, letting her father handle the situation. She knew that he was doing everything in his power to make sure she was protected, and that gave her a sense of peace, despite everything. In the end, the incident served as a harsh reminder that even in an age where people were more connected than ever, things could still spiral out of control in the blink of an eye. What had started as a routine flight had turned into a public spectacle that no one would forget. But for Tasha, there was one silver lining: the unwavering support of her father. No matter what happened next, she knew she would never face anything alone. The incident didn't end on the plane. It was just the beginning of a much larger story that would echo long after the flight had landed. Jay Winters wasn't the kind of man who would let an injustice slide, especially not one involving his family. The moment the plane touched down, Jay wasted no time in ensuring that the situation wouldn't be forgotten. He immediately contacted his legal team, instructing them to file an official complaint against the airline. The slap that Brittany had delivered to Tasha was no small matter. It wasn't just a physical act of aggression. It was a violation of respect, dignity, and professionalism. Jay understood the weight of the incident, and he knew that it had to be addressed not only for his daughter's sake, but for the sake of everyone who had ever been mistreated by someone in a position of power. The airline, caught in the whirlwind of public backlash, had quickly offered a financial settlement, but Jay refused. He wasn't interested in a quick payout or sweeping the matter under the rug. Money wasn't what mattered to him. What mattered was the principle. No one, regardless of who they were, should be treated with such disrespect. He wanted a public acknowledgement that what had happened was wrong, a clear statement that the airline would take responsibility for the actions of its staff and work to ensure that something like this would never happen again. Within a week, the airline had no choice but to comply with Jay's demands. They issued a public apology, acknowledging the mistake and expressing regret for how Tasha had been treated. The apology was a significant step, but Jay wasn't done yet. The company took further action by firing Brittany, the flight attendant who had slapped his daughter. Her actions, as unprofessional and unjustified as they were, had not only violated company policy, but had also led to a public relations nightmare that the airline couldn't afford to ignore. The message was clear. The airline would not tolerate such behavior, and it would take the necessary steps to ensure that its staff understood the importance of treating passengers with respect. But Jay's influence didn't stop there. The airline took this opportunity to reevaluate its entire approach to customer service. They began retraining all staff on how to properly handle confrontations, de-escalate tense situations, and, most importantly, treat passengers with dignity and respect. It was a hard lesson learned, one that came at the expense of an innocent passenger and a very public scandal. Yet the incident had led to real change, something Jay could take pride in. He had turned a moment of personal humiliation for his daughter into a stepping stone for broader change within the airline industry. For Tasha, though the memory of the slap still stung, there was a sense of relief. Her father had stepped in when she needed him the most, protecting her from something she couldn't have predicted or stopped on her own. She knew that her father's love and support had no boundaries, and that realization brought her a deep sense of comfort. Jay had always been there for her, guiding her, supporting her, helping her navigate the challenges that came with being a Winters. He had taught her the importance of resilience, of standing up for what was right, and of never backing down when it came to protecting the people you loved. This incident, as painful as it was, had only reinforced those lessons. It reminded her that, no matter what happened in life, her father would always have her back. She wasn't just a daughter. To him, she was someone he would go to any lengths to protect. The slap, the confrontation, the fallout, it was all behind them now. Tasha had been through worse in her life. Business setbacks, personal challenges. But this was different. This wasn't just about her career or her reputation. This was about her dignity as a person, and her father had made sure that it was restored. The story of the slap would eventually fade from the headlines, as all scandals eventually do. Media attention would die down, and the public's interest would move on to the next big thing. But for those who were on that flight, the memory of the event would linger. They would remember the shock of the slap, the tension in the cabin, the way Jay Winters had walked up to confront the flight attendant with quiet authority. They would remember the sense of relief they felt when the situation was finally diffused, and Brittany was escorted off the plane. For them, it was a reminder of how quickly things could change, how a simple flight could turn into a chaotic scene with just one wrong move. But more than that, it was a reminder of the power of family. Tasha knew this better than anyone. It wasn't just about the money, the public apology, or the firing of the flight attendant. What mattered most was the unshakable bond she shared with her father. No matter what happened in life, she would always have her family to rely on. They were her rock, her foundation, and the people who would always stand by her no matter how difficult the circumstances. In the aftermath of the incident, as Tasha and her father began to move on with their lives, there was a renewed sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons learned, for the way her father had handled the situation with grace and authority, and for the fact that they had faced the storm together. Tasha had always known her father was strong, but this incident had shown her just how far he would go to protect her. It wasn't just about money or status. It was about love. And that, more than anything, was what she would carry with her from that day forward. For Jay Winters, the fight was over. The airline had taken responsibility, and the necessary steps were in motion to ensure that the mistake wouldn't be repeated. But for Tasha, the memory of that moment would stay with her forever. It would remind her that no matter how much success she achieved or how high she climbed in her own career, she would always have her father's unwavering support. She wasn't alone. No matter where life took her, she would always have the security of knowing that her family, her father in particular, would be there for her, standing beside her through everything. It was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life, and one that would shape the person she would become. The slap had been a jarring moment, one that shook her to her core, but in the end, it had reinforced the truth she had always known. Family was everything. If you enjoyed this story and want more shocking moments like this, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. And hey, drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were in Tasha's shoes? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.